É um prazer enorme estar aqui hoje para abrir o segundo ciclo dos seminários da 21ª Bienal de Arte Contemporânea Sesc Vídeo Brasil. Ao pensar essa Bienal, eu e o trio de curadores, o Gabriel Bogossian, aqui presente, a Luísa Duarte e o Miguel Lopes, também aqui, que vai participar da mesa com a Lúcia, entendemos que era imprescindível que o tema norteador, Comunidades Imaginadas, se desdobrasse em várias direções e nas 3 plataformas da Bienal, que é a exposição, os programas públicos e nas publicações impressas. Eu convido a todos aqui que não viram ainda a exposição, depois do seminário, subir ao 5º andar para ver essa exposição que está bastante poderosa. Além da exposição, existem os programas de filmes, que também é um programa super importante, super potente, as visitas guiadas e ações que acontecem em diferentes andares aqui do Sesc 24 de Maio. Sobre programas públicos, o fato de estarmos juntos aqui hoje, celebrando, entre outras coisas, a primeira vinda da Lippard ao Brasil, vem confirmar a importância do encontro, a potência de nos reunirmos pessoalmente e de corpo presente para falar de arte e de política em tempos tão turbulentos. Entre 15 e 17 de outubro, tivemos uma primeira sequência de seminários em que falamos sobre imaginação, vida virtual, práticas pedagógicas, entre outros temas, em conversas multidisciplinares e riquíssimas. Nessa segunda jornada de mais de 6 encontros, 2 encontros na tarde de hoje, 2 na tarde de amanhã e 2 na quinta-feira. Temos, além dessa conferência da Lucy, conversas envolvendo produção simbólica dos movimentos sociais, imprensa e ativismo LGBT, feminismos, produção imagética do mundo indígena e uma mesa sobre memória e política nos acervos latino-americanos. Essa programação, que faz parte dos programas públicos da Bienal, foi desenhada pela Luísa Duarte, uma das curadoras convidadas, que infelizmente não pôde estar conosco hoje, pois está fora do Brasil, finalizando sua tese de doutorado. Eu gostaria de agradecer a Luísa, assim como agradeço aos curadores aqui presentes, pelo trabalho tão potente de perto comigo nesse projeto. O Gabriel, como eu já falei, e o Miguel, o Gabriel responsável pela exposição, basicamente, e o Miguel pelas publicações. Ainda sobre os seminários, eu gostaria de contar que, em breve, todas essas mesas estarão disponíveis em vídeo no canal VB e no hot site da Bienal. A nossa plataforma de conteúdo na internet, que é o canal VB, e que boa parte das falas desses ciclos vai se transformar no livro Leituras, uma publicação impressa a ser lançada no início do próximo ano, ainda no período da Bienal, que se encerra no dia 2 de fevereiro. Muito obrigada a todos, e eu quero convidar o Miguel e a Lucy para sentarem à mesa. Obrigada a todos.
Boa tarde, estou muito feliz por estar aqui com vocês novamente. É um grande prazer ter a Lippard como parte dos seminários que organizou a Luísa Duarte, como parte do programa de exposição Bienal do Brasil. É um prazer, é a primeira vez que Luísa viaja para o Brasil e eu acho que também é uma ocasião muito especial para poder conversar o que vem acontecendo, eu acho que Lucy vai falar disso também, o que vem acontecendo nos Estados Unidos e em Brasil, e qual é o papel do arte nesses processos de resistência e de crítica ao autoritarismo. Eu queria apresentar a Lucy muito brevemente, eu vou ler aqui a biografia. Lucy Lippard é escritora, ativista e curadora. Pesquisa ativismos na arte, feminismo, arqueologia e uso da terra. Es autora de libros como Undermining a Wild Ride Through Land Use, Politics and Art in the Changing West, de 2014, y Mixed Blessings, New Art in a Multicultural America, de 1999, y foi premiada con a Guggenheim Fellowship. Ela mora e vive em Novo México, Estados Unidos. E a Lucy vai apresentar uma fala titulada What do we want to say? How do we want to say it? E depois da apresentação dela, a gente vai conversar um pouco e eu convido vocês a fazer perguntas para a Lucy. Eu acho que é uma oportunidade muito especial. Assim que eu agradeço vocês e dou a palavra para a Lucy.
Do that with this. I'll see if I can get this. Esta fala está dedicado a Mariela Franco y Paulino Guajajara. and that's it for the Portuguese. I have to say right away that I'm blown away by what's going down, and I mean down, in my country and in your country. This talk reflects my frustration and outrage, and yes, fear from the viewpoint of a cultural worker. Neither Trump nor Bolsonaro came into power legitimately. What? People are always telling me to talk slower. I'm not really capable of it. So Trump lost the popular vote, so calling him a populist is ironic. Culture is low on the list of censorship and power, luckily, but until the US election of November 2016, I had the illusion that my generation of leftists and activist artists had had some successes among our failures during the culture wars of the 1980s. Seeing so many of them collapse, these successes, under the current attack on civil liberties, the environment, immigrants, children, people of color, poor people, anyone who disagrees with the president, has been a really bewildering eye-opener. Now all I have to offer is questions, like the title of this talk. What do we want to say? How do we want to say it? This question is addressed as much to myself as to other concerned art workers around the globe. Socially and politically, I'm used to being able to see the slides, I'm sorry. Socially and politically engaged artists, like everyone else, have to choose among the tsunami of issues that we should be weighing in on, fighting for, resisting, with compelling visual ideas. But sometimes it feels like we're spread so thin we'll blow away. I live in the arid high desert of New Mexico in the southwestern United States. So my list is headed by climate chaos, water, indigenous rights, saving public lands from the extraction industries. This is by Ronald Riel and Virginia Sanfratello. It's the pink seesaw across the wall from the US-Mexico border. So it went on for a little while, and it was shared play from both sides of the border, unheard of. And immigration is one of the major issues because New Mexico, of course, is a border state. The youthful undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Central America living under DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, kids who came when they were too young to make up their own minds to the US, are especially heartbreaking. Their lives are in limbo because they have the courage to risk their futures by speaking out. Then there are the cruel and unfair immigration policies, the deportations, the refusal of asylum, the tearing of children from their families. Around the world, climate refugees are already surfacing along with economic and political asylum seekers, and Brazilian indigenous tribes are among the most endangered. One subtle and powerful work was Doris Salcedo's Palimpsesto at Madrid's Reina Sofia Museum, in which drops of water formed the names of those who lost their lives trying to reach a better life in Europe. In northern Italy, Marguerite Carl is a co-founder of Conmoy, a refugee community
and the group Permaculture for Refugees. Artists everywhere are beginning to step up to the plate on issues surrounding immigration and climate change. This is the Middle Eastern wall, the Israeli wall, keeping the Palestinians out of half of their turf. The rest of the endless litany is, of course, equally important: creeping fascism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, Middle Eastern wars, and justice for Palestine. And alas, the list is longer still. I look at all these issues through a feminist lens. As art workers, we have to ask ourselves once again, what do we want to say, and how do we want to say it, and to whom? For decades, socially engaged artists have talked about reaching broader audiences, something that the Tunisian French public artist J.R., who did this, has actually achieved. And I could never resist using this after a baby with asthma from the god-awful pollution. The Belgian muralist Roa has worked in Brazil on behalf of endangered species. And their rural American counterpart, Jetsonorama, aka Chip Thomas, who's an African-American physician who's worked on the Navajo reservation, or nation, for 25 years, and anonymously wheat pastes walls around the nation. Here are a huge lump of coal is poised over the little girl's head like the sword of Damocles. This piece is by Post Commodity, which is a Native American group, now somewhat diminished, but it had Native people from several nations. Conventional wisdom has it that art speaks for itself. So even the goal of saying something beyond the artwork can be contentious. James Baldwin has said that the purpose of art is to lay bare the questions which have been hidden by the answers. And that's an amazing gift and an amazing responsibility. The world is in turmoil. So what is the role of socially engaged artists? As Navajo musician and former Post-Commodity Collective co-founder Raven Chacon says in his own work in museums and concert halls, the streets, and on the Navajo Nation, he says, it's not for everybody, but it is for anybody. And that's probably as good as it gets. Put it out there, see if it works. If it doesn't, try something different. I've long advocated for art that escapes the mainstream art world and elopes with life. Social energies not yet recognized as art. For decades, I've written wishfully about escape attempts, art workers trying to break out of the art world, and they're usually drawn back in, as I have been over and over again. Many years ago, I found my community among other would-be escape artists, those who've led the way out of the art world towards life. This is by Oliver Ressler, an Austrian artist. Talking to artist friends, I find that one of the issues that most concerns them is how far outside the art world artists can work and still be satisfied that they're making art. And not at all incidentally still be recognized as artists, not called sociologists or merely activists. And how can they still make a living outside of the aesthetic sandbox my generation was nurtured in? It's not easy to totally disavow recognition by the market and the institutions. And if you've managed to do it, we probably don't know what you're doing. Does it matter? Is it still art? Who cares? As in gender identities, the boundaries are buckling and blurring. When the British collective Forensic Architecture was nominated for the Turner Prize, they were surprised because they didn't consider themselves to be artists. Their mission is to produce visual evidence for international prosecutors, human rights organizations, and political and environmental justice groups around the world. And they were wary of becoming part of the art financial complex. Yet they can also be seen as part of the activist branch of public practice. That is, art that's issue-oriented and grassroots-based, with artists working out in the world or in communities with, not just for, the people who live there. Such work can be based in subversion on one hand and empowerment on the other. The controlling factors are the collaborators and/or audiences focused on the contexts in which the projects take place, and how well, how sensitively, and how effectively the artists make these connections. Social sustainability, like environmental sustainability, is all about context, and decontextualization can be counterproductive. The artist's dilemma The choice between remaining independent and relatively powerless or being co-opted by the powerful mainstream art world is decades long. This is a well-known piece by Hans Haacke in 1971 after his show at the Guggenheim Museum was canceled because they took the side of slum landlords that he was doing a piece about. And so then he did a research piece on the political affiliations and business dealings of the trustees of the Guggenheim Museum. And this was really one of the very beginnings of institutional critiques. So perhaps the toughest question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we value most? Individual success or a collective social advocacy? Over the years, a lot of smart things have been said about the possibilities for artists who take on social issues to be included in museums, though it may take decades for them to be accepted. Ask Hans Haacke, who is just now having a show the first time in like 25 years or something in the United States. Haacke has always named names, a basic taboo within the mainstream. He's managed to remain in the more often European art context by very thoroughly studying his targets from outside: corporations, politics, cities, collectors, nations, history. I'm sorry, that was a piece of Hans for Documenta, the last Documenta, I think. And of course, you can also be making powerful abstract art that opens up perceptions of the world and still take responsibility for your place in it, like Harmony Hammond's veiled but powerful reflections on queering abstraction that have made her a hero in American LGBTQ communities. Suzanne Lacey, my longtime social practice mentor, is a genius at aesthetically contextualizing non-art contexts, at choreographing collective expression, bringing unheard voices to the foreground, if not exactly to the center. And this is her work in a British industrial town that is newly diverse, a large Muslim community. And she works with people for a year or two talking about the issues, and then they do a beautifully aesthetic performance kind of thing that zeroes in on these issues. Suzanne has said that she hasn't been interested in addressing the art world. If she hadn't been interested in addressing the art world, she would have gone into politics, crediting Alan Capro with showing her the advantages of putting life into the gallery and putting the gallery into life. She doesn't start with a clear idea. It arrives as it's generated by those she's working with at the table. She says, the art world is where I get to talk. The community is where I get to listen. It's not news to you that artists working in communities have to work with communities. And sometimes social success means aesthetic sacrifice. One example of this I saw firsthand back in the 1970s when I was living with Charles Simmons, who made this piece. He was working with Mobilization for Youth on New York's Lower East Side to design a park in a vacant lot based on his imaginary landscapes that he did, little miniature landscapes inhabited by invisible little people. The art idea was this, a strikingly incongruous topography in the barrio. The result was the addition of a kid's slide to the hill and a mural, and these drastically altered the intended scale and the aesthetic impact. But despite the sacrifice of aesthetics, it was a real social success, and this is one of the choices that artists have. This is by Chloe Bass. It's called The Book of Everyday Instructions, a performance about intimacy, understanding, and empathy. There was a panel in Santa Fe on feminism and intersectionality a year or two ago that emphasized radical inclusiveness and made several points about entering a community that is not our own. Take part, but don't take the lead. Curiosity is good, but not voyeurism. Honesty is good, condescension isn't. You can't fake empathy. Have we educated ourselves about unfamiliar cultures? Listen. Who are they and who are we? Shouldn't it just be we altogether? Do they even want our help? This slogan from South Africa, in a poster by Ricardo Morales, hangs over my desk. Whoops, no, it doesn't. So, did I miss one? Can I go back on this? Oh, well, I guess it's later. Okay. So this you recognize. Arundhati Roy has said there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. In the last few years, groups formerly perceived as voiceless have stood up and finally been heard. In North America, indigenous people, no, sorry, these two got mixed up. That's the South African saying. This is a piece by Kanapa Hanska Luger, who is a Lakota, who was raised in Standing Rock. In North America, indigenous people at Standing Rock and Idle No More and Red Nation have raised consciousness not only about pipelines and clean water and treaty rights, but suddenly the American art world knows something about Indians, which they didn't know much about before. This is a piece that he did at Standing Rock with mirror shields, so that the people attacking them saw themselves. This is not a new tactic, but I think it's been done several other times, but this was particularly beautiful at Standing Rock. We're still a long way from achieving the gender and racial fluidity that we hope for, but the Me Too and Time's Up movements are resurrecting feminist issues. This is by Teresa Newsom. Black Lives Matter has changed the dialogue around racism in the US and upped the ante, provoking as a byproduct some real soul searching about the nature of whiteness, which has also been the focus of the work by Peggy Diggs, who happens to be traveling with me this year. This is by the Yes Men. I hope you've heard of them. They are the most marvelous interveners in the business world. Rather than spending a lot of energy on how to get artists' names and arts out into the world, it can be more productive to team up with progressive organizers and activists already committed to and educated on the issues. They can teach us, they can save us time, and they can make our work more effective. Although sadly in the US, they often don't trust artists. It's not always easy to convince your natural collaborators that your art can make their work more compelling. Instead of being grateful for proposals, organizations, political or lefty political organizations, are often wary of partnering with artists and/or they're fed up with artistic egos. They may not know how effectively a good artist can undermine repetitive didacticism and jolt consciousness with humor or striking visuals. I remember a march in Washington in the early 1980s opposing US intervention in Central America, when a group of us had spent a lot of time and energy working up a cultural presentation, including a huge inflatable Pac-Man. If you're old enough, you remember I Can't Believe I Ate It All, a TV ad at that point. And everything was behind schedule, and the march organizers said, let's just cut the cultural stuff. And we prevailed, but it was very disheartening. In many Latin American countries, I learned while working with Central American issues, artists are far more respected and feared. Bolsonaro's hostility toward the arts and his disbanding of the Ministry of Culture seems to follow this trajectory. In contemporary arts and in a planetary context, sustainability has become a catchword, a truism, the fate of so many good ideas planted in the wrong soils. I prefer the term environmental justice. What do we want to sustain? Certainly not the status quo. Western so-called civilization? Maybe all civilization. How about the entire planet and everything on it? How do we do that? It seems that the world is just beginning to understand that social sustainability is inextricably linked to ecological sustainability, which is a basic necessity for survival and for public practice art. This is a McMansion that I got off the internet. Sustainability is dependent on empathy and downsizing, both of which are hard to achieve in a capitalist society that's based entirely on unsustainable growth, non-stop for-profit expansion, and to hell with the consequences. Growth of everything from McMansions to nuclear arsenals to strip mines to corporate conglomerates to even ever larger and more expensive installations and artworks. E.F. Schumacher's influential 1973 book, Small is Beautiful, Economics as If People Mattered, occupies a small but beautiful place in our pantheon. This is by Mary Mattingly, the comment on the Anthropocene. I hope, yeah. In this century, small is no longer just beautiful, it's crucial. It's not just a matter of tiny and portable houses, urban infill, thrift shops, resource conservation, environmental protection, recycling, and Planned Parenthood. It's a psychological impetus that's needed everywhere. So downsize or die. Halt or at least slow growth until some sort of sustainable justice to both people and the planet is reached. Part of the downsizing for socially engaged and eco-artists is conceiving of one's art within the context of unsustainable resources, like water and fossil fuels and big money. Building toward the future instead of planning for posterity, spending time and energy in our own communities. So many of us are still searching for our post-capitalist self, an alternative to the rugged individualism of manifest destiny, but an alternative that allows working people a decent living and human rights, which are, alas, being rapidly downsized too. I have great faith in small-scale projects like the arts and their potential to spread into larger spheres. The challenge is to make the work interesting enough to draw viewers in and profound enough to keep them there, to make them think, make us think. This is by Lorraine O'Grady. This was an early piece in the early 1980s where she went through Harlem with a float with these frames to show that everybody in Harlem was not only the audience but the subject, not the object but the subject of work, that Harlem was home to a great many people and they should be considered in art and know about art and so forth. The strongest public practice, like activism, starts from a specific location, from consciously lived experience, and then it has to move on out from there in a kind of ripple effect. If you don't know your neighborhood, real or figurative, you're likely to either idealize or disparage its inhabitants, fail to recognize threats, and choose the wrong solutions as the basis of your art. So where do you live? Where's your center? How far out do the ripples go? Are you following them? Or are you remaining at the center and holding the reins? Who are you working with? Who do you live with? You should recognize this. And of course, as Brazilians, you're living with the devastating destruction of the Earth's most diverse ecosystem, the lungs of the planet in Amazonia. You're certainly aware that Bolsonaro is delivering on his promise of an anti-environmental reign. This is by Edgar Heap of Birds, who's a Cheyenne Arapaho native. He made this years ago, but it's all too prescient now. Since he took office, Bolsonaro, logging in the Amazon has increased by more than 40%, and carbon emissions have increased by some 212% over last year. That's frightening even for those of us living thousands of miles away. I remember when environmentalism was considered soft politics, unrelated to social revolutions, and that has changed. For some of us, the best way to deal with the onslaught of urgent global issues is trying to strengthen our local community. For those who come from generations of deracination, it's hard to work with rooted communities when one can identify no home place of one's own. I insisted in this 1997 book called The Lure of the Local that wherever we find ourselves, even for short periods, we have to take responsibility for that place as long as we're there. I talk about senses of place, plural, because it's about personal relationships with place, and we all have different relationships with the place we live. Listening to the stories of longtime occupants of the places where we live or work is one way of knowing where we've landed, or for however long or short a time. This is my driveway. 25 years ago, after decades of organizing, wheat pasting, protesting, and urging artists into the streets of New York, which was like herding cats, I moved to a tiny semi-rural New Mexico village. Today, my activism consists of community planning, the local fire department and the water board, cultural resource protection, opposing drought development and fossil fuel extraction. 3 of my last 4 books were on local history and archaeology. This is one that is in press right now. Anyway, I found that a concentration on place, which isn't the same thing as land or site or landscape, can bring everything into focus, including politics. This may not resonate with urban activists, but disillusioned rural Americans are at the heart of the rise of nationalism in the US, and this rift must be healed or at the very least understood. Urban and rural strategies on place tend to be different, but the issues are the same. This is by Sue Friedrich, who made this comment in Brooklyn. As she says, artists used to live here. Gentrification is as common in rural as in urban areas, though its impact is different. Art workers settling in little villages or urban barrios inadvertently change a community. Artists are the flying wedge of gentrification, usually unintentionally. This is the village I and Peggy live in, an aerial view. The issues that affect the once rural village, population 260 people, are certainly as global as they are local, but it's the local that's visible, and it's the local that we have a chance to affect. New Mexico, one of the poorest states in the Union, there used to be a bumper sticker saying, "Thank God for Mississippi," because it was always a little bit poorer than we were, not always. Where the diminishing number of elders speak Spanish as their first language, it can seem like another planet. One old Hispano gentleman told me kindly that when I got old and sick, I'd probably want to go back to my own country. And he's right. I immigrated from a foreign country, New York's Lower Manhattan. This is President Trump's resort underwater. I wish I knew who did this. I got it from someplace and I don't know who the genius behind it was. This era, called since 2000 the Anthropocene, is also dubbed the Misanthropocene, or the era Mesoic, an era of loneliness and isolation, as species go extinct and desertion or desertification, as the oceans rise and the groundwaters sink. The sense of urgency is so overwhelming it can stop us in our tracks and make us hide our heads in the sand. Sea level around Manhattan is projected to rise 6 feet within the century. Huge cities can't build a wall the way the wealthy do to protect their seaside summer homes. And we know from Cold War Germany, Israel-Palestine, and the US-Mexico border that walls are never the answer. In New Mexico, the momentous challenge is lack of water, a vast drought with the overexploitation of the Colorado and Rio Grande rivers. That's the Rio Grande Dry. And this was a piece a bunch of thousands of us did in Santa Fe. The Santa Fe River was totally dry. And so we re-watered it with blue tarps and bath mats and towels and so on over our heads. And this was a project for 350.org, which is the climate change group. This is by Chris Jordan, who worked in the Midway Islands for a while, a bird who had eaten plastic. As things race out of control and we do nothing, as we allow our environment to be destroyed, as we run out of water, as we witness species extinction before we've even learned the lessons they have to teach us, and as we deny climate chaos, we should know that similar catastrophes have happened to the planet many times before. It's a creature. It's by Michaela Rovner. The blip in time that's the human race will not be missed, but will miss us a lot. It's coming down to a race between humans and climate change to see who can get rid of us first. How can artists help change the way humans relate to nature and to each other? We share DNA with every form of life on the planet. Apparently we have a great deal in common with bananas in terms of DNA. It's not too late for humanity to consider the legal rights of nature herself, especially rivers. Indigenous people are demanding rights for nature and for themselves, from India to Ecuador to Canada to New Zealand, where the Wanganui River and a 400,000 acre national park taken from the Maoris has been designated as a person, not property. Land belongs to itself. What a concept. Nature, which of course includes us, should not be a commodity we can sell off to the highest bidder. It's a community that we belong to and we harm at our own risk. The clocks are ticking. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists just advanced their doomsday clock to 2 minutes to midnight, citing increasing concerns over nuclear weapons and climate change. And that's the closest it's been to terminal disaster since 1953, when the US and USSR exploded thermonuclear weapons. And it was reported before the release of Trump's nuclear posture review, talk about posturing, which significantly increases the dangers. Everything's coming down to the pike far faster than we imagined it. I used to worry about my grandsons and future generations down the line. Now I worry as much about my son, who's only in his early 50s. At the risk of sounding retrograde, I want to consider the necessity to think about history. Not just the past, but the continuous present, as Gertrude Stein put it. This is by Janet Koenig. She made this years ago, maybe in the early 80s. It's the famous Teddy Roosevelt statue outside of the Museum of Natural History, American Museum in New York, and the figures of the Indian and the African American are much smaller in the real image. So there's this giant Teddy Roosevelt on his horse and these two little creatures on the side. What Janet did is she brought the Indian and the African American up to be parallel and as big as Teddy. I think it's a brilliant piece. History is that stuff we take for granted that's all too often misrepresented, the lies that haunt us and hold us hostage. Indigenous peoples often face the past as a way to move into the future, or as American amnesiac society would say, to move backwards. History is surfacing more often these days as we try to imagine our futures, figure out where we went wrong, and look back from Trump's US and Bolsonaro's Brazil at lessons from Hitler's Germany or Franco's Spain. I retain my admiration for that ultimate and eye-opening feminist truisms, the personal is political, and for its significant other, the political is personal. This is my 80th birthday with my friends from the Heresies Collective, which we had 5 of us in New Mexico, and given that it was a New York collective and magazine, it was kind of a great moment. These remain living and dynamic propositions, a brilliant way to translate lived experience, positive and negative, into political consciousness. They open ways to understand others' experiences. When we know our families' histories and those of our neighbors and of our lands, who and where we are in a political historical sense, we're far better equipped to be compassionate and collaborative within a time and place we all share. You recognize this? Your anti-torture monument. Some advocate destruction of offensive monuments to evildoers. Others recommend their removal to museums as educational artifacts of an unlamented past, or erect new ones with improved values. This is Tortura Nunca Mais, is this piece. This is a temporary monument to Marielle Franco, or to mourn our heroes. But the small Italian town of Bolzano had a better idea, to use each one of these abominations as a teaching moment, an idea that's spreading internationally. Keep the monuments in situ and then get artists, historians, lawyers, community activists to work on a public reply. This is the Mussolini monument. In this case, a relief celebrating Mussolini, whose slogan was "Believe, Obey, Combat." The artists who corrected fascist grandiloquence with intellectual minimalism were Arnold Holzek and Michel Bernardi. What they did was they superimposed a neon quote from Hannah Arendt, "Nobody has the right to obey." As Professor Carlo Inverizzi Accetti writes, nothing can be learned from something removed or erased or denied. History is a process of sedimentation. This is a monument by Fred Wilson. In response to those who want to simply destroy offensive objects, an increasing number of artists are now creating works that invite the public to reflect on our histories rather than censoring memories. Fred Wilson's E Pluribus Unum proposed to revise the image of the only African American in the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Indianapolis by giving him a prouder stance, holding a patchwork flag of all the African countries. The project was canceled. Olu Ogibe's Monument for Strangers and Refugees in Kassel, Germany, an obelisk bearing the biblical quote, "I was a stranger and you took me in," was removed and then reinstalled at a less significant site. This is Michael Rakowitz's, he's a Jewish American Iraqi artist. It's a replica of winged gods from the Nergal Gate in Nineveh, destroyed by ISIS. 10,500 Iraqi date syrup cans make up this sculpture. Ultimately, words and images offer ways to integrate our own imaginings of life into those of a polity. Imagine Action, all one word, was the title of a conference organized by the Alliance for Cultural Democracy in the early 1980s. The relationship of imagination to reality and action is crucial, especially for artists and writers like those of us who specialize in visualizing change, acting in the famous gap between art and life. If we lean too far on the imagination side, we risk falling off the edge into wishful thinking, like visualize world peace, and then fall back onto the couch. Lean too far on the reality side, and we risk getting so discouraged that we get stuck in the status quo. This is by Papas Fritas, who is a Chilean artist, isn't he? We art workers have always had to be satisfied with small victories, with raising consciousness rather than changing policies. We can fool ourselves about how successful our projects are. A friend says she wishes she had a penny for every time she's heard an artist claim to be changing the world. Yet I suspect that most of us in this room have some faith in art's capacity to transform, inspire, and or jolt or at least pinprick people out of their self-imposed or received stupors. It can add visual layers to the global debates. I always say that art workers can't change the world alone, but with the right allies, little miracles can happen. Well, maybe not miracles, but a lot of hard work, organizing, catalyzing, and hanging in. Organizing can encourage clear-eyed analyses of what works and what doesn't. We need to discuss the failures as often as we tout the successes. These times call for some tough love and honesty with ourselves and our colleagues, because being effective seems more crucial today than any other time I can remember. And I've been messing with this stuff for some 60 years. So again, I better explain this. This is by Joyce Cutler Shaw, done in the 1970s outside the United Nations. She took water from rivers all over the world, froze it to survival, and then survival was melting. So again, what do we want to say, and how do we want to say it, and where do we go from here? The journey will be different in every nation and every region. I trust you haven't been holding your breath for the answers to these questions, because obviously I don't have them. And there's a fine line between skepticism and cynicism. Some say that pessimism is a waste of time, while others dismiss optimists as utopian or politically reactionary. It's true that we need to be grounded in reality, however unpleasant. But we also need something to hope for, to long for, to reach for. I hardly ever give a talk without citing this Antonio Gramsci quote, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will." I don't think it's ever been better said. Thank you.
I'm going to speak in English now. Speak in English, so we can speak in English. Oh, we can speak. Yes, yeah, it's good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for your talk and for your very provocative set of questions and personal reflections about how can art speak urgently about the world. I think it's very inspiring, and I have some questions for you. I don't want to be the only one to talk with Lucy, so really please prepare some comments or questions to share with Lucy. Maybe my first question is kind of a silly one, and it just to give some context, because it's quite important that you are here now. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about your relationship with Latin America, because I know that your visits to Latin America in the late 60s changed your perceptions of art and politics.
Is this thing on? Yeah, whoops, yes, it is. Well, my relationship with Latin America came sort of by accident. When I graduated from college, I couldn't afford to go to Europe, and I'd been to Spain and liked it, and so I managed to get a scholarship from the American Friends Service Committee to work in a little tiny village in Mexico, in Puebla, Mexico, and called San Salvador el Verde. And across the Barranca was San Salvador el Seco. So I was lucky to be in El Verde. But it was the first time I'd spent any time in the so-called third world. And it was not a shock, but it was fascinating. I mean, I wanted to actually stay in Mexico, but my best friend was getting married and I had to be a bridesmaid. So I went back to New York, and I stayed there. But, and then probably the next thing, and then I fell into a sort of formalist art historical context for a few years. And then the next thing that happened in 1968, I was asked to jury a show in Buenos Aires with Jean Clay, who was a French critic. And usually when you have jurors, you have 3 of them, because then you have 2 to 1, and you can vote on things. We were supposed to give prizes. It was a big sculpture show that was funded by plastics industries. And, but they only had 2 of us, which was sort of, we wondered about that. And it turned out that they were hoping we would disagree and they would get to decide. Because they had one special artist that they wanted to get the grand prize, and we didn't like his work. So we were giving the prizes, and the night before we gave a press conference about the prizes and so forth, they announced there was another prize had just come out of the sky. And they obviously thought this guy was going to get it, and we didn't want to give it to this guy. So we had a very uncomfortable press conference, and when it came time to leave, and then we met artists, and Jorge Glusberg was running a sort of artist collective in Buenos Aires. So he took us, they wouldn't let us speak to artists while we were judging this thing. But then when we got loose, we started speaking to artists, and he introduced us to the Rosario group, and it was artists mostly from Buenos Aires, I think, who were working with workers in Tucumán, and they were called the Rosario group. And we met them halfway between Buenos Aires and Rosario, and it was such an interesting talk. I mean, for me, I guess I was probably on the edge of this already. I was a sort of good liberal, but I wasn't really a lefty. And the artists talked about how I said, why are you doing this? And they said, because we don't want to make art as is usually accepted when the world is a mess. We're going to work to change the world first. And I'd never heard an artist say that. The artists I knew were mostly in studios, and you know, I admired them. I was married to one and so forth. But this was a whole new take for me. So Latin America has been, and since then I've gone to, that same trip actually, I went to Lima by myself, and then to Cuzco and to see the ruins and things. I didn't have the money for a car or anything, so I set out on foot to see Ollantaytambo and various things. And I was luckily sort of adopted by an Argentine couple who showed me all the rest of the wonderful, incredible places. And I went to Machu Picchu by myself and so forth. So that was, again, a sort of an archaeological moment, which has since reverberated in my life. And then in New York, I had a lot of Latino friends. Susana Torre, an Argentine architect, was a very close friend, lived in the apartment under mine. And I met Eduardo Costa and Elio Chisica and Fernando Massa and Alejandro Puente and so on and so forth. But anyway, and the only person from the Rosario group that I've still been in touch with is Gabriela Carnevale, who came to visit me in New Mexico a couple of years ago. So that was interesting. But these things all made a huge difference to somebody who was raised like in the middle class, and my parents loved art, and they were Sunday painters, and so I went into the art world thinking that this is where the free people live. This is the liberated part of society, and of course I found out it wasn't any more than any other place, because the art world is very contained in its own little playground. And it's only been in the last couple of decades that more of the artists that I'm showing and so on have come up. And not that there weren't people beforehand. Hans Haacke was always a friend and an influence and so forth. But anyway, and since then I have been to Colombia and Mexico a few times and so forth. So. But I was dying to get to Brazil, so.
Yes. And there is another thing that you mentioned in your talk that is very present in your whole reflection, and I wanted to ask you about that. What it meant for you to apply this feminist lens? You said that. What it meant for you to apply this feminist lens to social problems and to the art world back in the 60s and 70s?
Well, again, it was. I wanted to be one of the boys. I thought I was one of the boys. So when a group called Women Artists in Revolution started within the Art Workers Coalition, which I wasn't very involved with, and that was mostly anti-Vietnam War and artists' rights, but nothing about sexism which of course existed within the organization. And so when these women started this, I was like, I don't want to be involved with that. I'm not really a woman. And then I lived for a few months in Spain under Franco. I make a practice of this. And wrote a novel which made me sort of into a feminist because I started looking at things through a different lens. And so I went back and fell into the feminist movement with a group of other feminists, and we did a lot of stuff. But since then, I mean, I spent a decade writing mostly about women's art and about feminism, and I didn't have any new ideas after that. I have to admit, I sort of talked I'm still with a total feminist and so on, but I write about women's art and men's art now, and not totally women's. Mainly because I say, I don't know if it's my generation or what, but that I didn't feel like I had anything new to say, whereas a very close friend of mine named Rebecca Solnit, who's a writer, is saying new stuff, and it's wonderful I love reading her because she's in a different place. She's my son's age, not my age, and that makes a difference, the generational. But it really pisses me off when young women say, well, I don't call myself a feminist. But I stand up for myself. I'm a strong woman, and my answer to that, which I say over and over again, is, well, that's very nice. I'm glad you're standing up for yourself, but feminists stand up for all women, not just for themselves. And I think this is a message that needs to be gotten across to the younger generation, whoever you are out there.
An important part of your talk was stressing the importance of collaboration between artists and, you said, progressive organizations and activism, right? And stressing the importance of taking art seriously and beyond frivolity and market hegemonic, structure. So I was wondering, what about institutions in these reflections? I mean, what is, for example, the role of institutions in this demand for collaboration?
I wish I knew. I mean, I have never worked for an institution except for when I got out of college. I worked for a few months for the Museum of Modern Art Library, which was an absolutely wonderful education. But I don't have any parti pris with institutions. I think institutions have changed hugely since 1958, which is when I was at the Museum of Modern Art. But at the same time, they haven't changed enough. I mean, it's still, if you have a good curator, then you're in good shape. But the institution itself and the trustees in particular are likely to be dragging their feet. And artists are recently really taking up, like the Whitney protest against the guy who manufactures tear gas and so forth. And the people are really beginning to look back at what Hans Haacke did in 1971, a while ago, and to really look at the politics of the institution, which is interesting. I mean, the Museum of Modern Art, I picketed them, and I thanked them for that. They sent me to graduate school, and I thanked them by picketing them all the time. But they were, in 1970, they let Kinniston McShine, who was a Trinidadian African-American, do this show called Information, which I hope you've all heard of. And this was a real breakthrough for the Museum of Modern Art. They'd never done anything activist. Hans Haacke did a piece where everybody polled whether they liked Nelson Rockefeller or not, who was eventually running for various offices. And so a lot of artists who never really expected to be in an institution were shown there. And then at the same time, like the Art Workers Coalition we were protesting things, and Joseph Kossuth made a fake entrance card to the museum marked artists, because we thought artists should get into the museum free. Some people do now. I think if you're in the collection, you get in free. But and we did things outside. When the trustees had a huge dinner, we gave Scott Burton, who was an art writer, gave away dimes to people, imitating the Rockefellers, who were basically behind the Museum of Modern Art, and so forth. Anyway, we did a lot of stuff to the institution. And within the lefty artists that I worked with, it was always interesting, because I think it was Leon Golub, who was certainly an outspoken resistor, said we deserve to, he was a painter, and we deserve to be in museums, that we should not boycott museums, because if we're not in museums, nobody will ever know what we're saying, and that was what I was sort of mentioned in here. And that was I never could really make up my mind where I stood on this. I mean, I was all for my friends who wanted to be in museums, but I wasn't so sure about it and so forth. So, but I don't, now things have changed. Does that answer? It doesn't really answer.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, definitely. Because I mean, part of your reflection about what is how our workers and cultural workers are participating critically in shaping a public sphere is, for me, is inevitable related to what is the role of institutions nowadays and how can cultural workers can demand transparency from institutions. I mean, the example of the transparency can demand transparency from the institutions, like they can be transparent about, how the money came from, for example, in the case of Whitney, right?
Yeah.
And this is a very important debate. So yes, and another thing that you said that I felt that was quite compelling is that sometimes social success means aesthetic sacrifice, right? You said that.
Yeah.
And I think it's very interesting, and I wanted to ask you about this, and maybe in relation to your work as curator, because yes, of course, sometimes social practice and public practice doesn't fit in the conventional categories of art making, and usually demand formalizations, material formalizations that goes beyond the white cube, right? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you, to you as curator, what are the curatorial strategies of alternative exhibition system that a curator could apply to actually deal with public practice and social practice?
I haven't curated a show for a long time, since 2007. It was a show on climate change, but I should say I'm not really a curator. I've done very few things in actual museums. I've done things in union halls and in the streets and in various kind of funky places, but not very often in museums. But one of the things that I really like the idea of, and I don't know whether my shows were the first ones or otherwise, but in 1969 and 70, I did some shows in Seattle and Vancouver. It was minimalism and conceptualism and earth art and all kinds of stuff, huge rambling shows with no particular point to them. But I had a lot of work that was outside of the museum, not in a sculpture garden, but way the hell outside. I mean, in a park over on the other side of the city, something in the barrio. I mean, so that you had to go. You couldn't just go to the museum. You had to go, and that is something I've been devoted to ever since. And the show that I did in Boulder, Colorado, on climate change was the same thing. We had something like 19 public pieces that were out of the museum and about different. And so people often didn't know that. I love the fact that when people can be hit by something, they don't know it's art. They're like, oh my God, I saw this thing and it made me think about such and such, but who knew it was art? And because for a lot of people, of course, art is just something framed in a museum or standing around in a museum. And so that is one of the places that I think museums can, and it's been done a lot since then. I mean, I think, so that wasn't really answering, but does that get there?
Yeah. No, I was just thinking, as you said, that sometimes social success means aesthetic sacrifice.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, the social practice, yeah. I mean, Suzanne Lacey, who I mentioned and who's been a big influence on my thinking about social practice and so on, has just had a huge museum show in San Francisco at both the San Francisco MoMA and at Yerba Buena across the street. So, and this was a challenge for her. She spent a lot of time agonizing about how her kind of work, which takes place definitely out of museums. I mean, in communities. She did a piece in, was it Ecuador? Or anyway, about domestic violence, where men read letters that had been written by people about domestic violence in a performance context, sort of. But she works with people for a long time before the actual thing happens. And but the museum show was beautiful, and it included a lot of, probably more than most people wanted to put up with, but a lot of talking heads, which were Oakland African-American school kids or domestic abusers or you name it, sort of people that we wouldn't have heard from generally. And so you had their faces or their bodies or whatever, and then they're talking about the issues, which is what her work really, and I think it opened a lot of eyes. It was a great show, but it is hard to figure out how you would be, once you get sort of cornered into a museum or trapped or imprisoned or something in a museum for this kind of work, it's difficult to know if that's the right thing to do or not. So.
I wanted to see if there is any questions or comments. I have more questions, but just to check if you would like to.
You agreed with everything I said? Well, apparently. We can wait while you think of a question.
We can wait, think about it. So another thing you said is that you remember the time when environmentalism was considered soft.
What?
That environmentalism was considered soft politics. You said that, right? And related to social revolutions. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little more about this. When was that moment when environmentalism was considered soft politics, and what happened? I mean, when did this started to change?
I don't really know, but I mean, remember, in the old days, like, I don't know, the 60s even, I guess there was Save the Whales and so on. And the left thought that was silly. What about the whales? Why would we care about the whales? I mean, they sort of vaguely got it, but nobody was that interested in that kind of thing. And then slowly, climate change obviously is the big moment where we suddenly realized what was going down and how bad it was going to be, and before that, there were a lot of people doing wonderful, wonderful work. And eco art is one of the places that I'm really interested in. I didn't get into it much here, but artists working with ecosystems, not painting pictures of landscapes or something, but looking at land use, and if possible, intervening in land use or whatever, or showing pictures of the Rio Grande totally dry or things like that people just don't realize is happening. And 350.org has an artist component who actually is Rebecca Solnit's brother, going around the country and getting artists to work. And the Santa Fe River piece I showed with the blue going down where we replaced the water, that was photographed from satellite. And 350.org did that, and I think they have a whole bunch of stuff they've done from satellite to give you literally a perspective, an aerial perspective on the earth and what's going down. And I mean, I'm sure everybody shares my distress about what's happening with the rainforest, so I won't get into that. But there's a new respect now, just in the last decade or so, I think, even though people have known about climate change for 100 years almost. But now it's finally getting out there. And I think one of the reasons it's getting out there is art.
Yes, okay. There is a question here. Thank you.
Okay. We are under the impact. Alô? Tá certo? Tá bom. Então,
português?
Como você quiser.
Português?
Posso falar inglês ou português?
Português.
I have a terrible time here.
Nós todos aqui no Brasil, né, e na América Latina estamos sobre o impacto do golpe de Estado na Bolívia, e que foi muito assustador e segue um novo modelo de golpe de Estado que inclui o terrorismo, matança, assassinato, incêndio de casas. E eu acho assim que é uma destruição total do contrato social, pela democracia e também pelo simbólico, né? E o que a gente está vendo hoje, e a gente vê todos os dias no campo da arte, é uma luta simbólica, né? Então essa seria uma primeira pergunta que eu queria fazer, se essa luta simbólica ainda faz sentido diante das novas táticas políticas que estão sendo perpetradas na América Latina e no nosso mundo aqui, especialmente. E uma outra questão também, que eu acho que é uma questão que surge, que eu acho que é um pouco difícil de eu formular, mas eu queria falar também, que é o seguinte: se a política exterior dos Estados Unidos, essa política de intervenção em outros países, que também foi decididamente vinculada nesse recente golpe do Estado da Bolívia, se é um assunto dos artistas e ativistas dos Estados Unidos.
I wish it were, but I can't say that it was. I mean, actually, the coup just happened, didn't it? I have a close friend who's living in Sucre, and I'm waiting to hear from her about what she thinks is going down and so forth. But no, I mean, most Americans, and I will include artists, a lot of artists anyway, are really ignorant about what goes on in the rest of the world. And I'm vaguely informed because I read a lot of stuff, but none of us, we don't get anything from public policy. I mean, I haven't seen, we've been in flight for 2 days or something, but I haven't seen anything where artists are realizing what's going down. My friend cellist Glendinning, who's a journalist and writer who's living in Sucre and is publishing in Bolivia, I expect to get something from her about what's going down there, but I'm not real hopeful. I mean, artists tend to, I mean, we're better at, I think American artists anyway, are better at dealing with large issues like racism or environmentalism or whatever. And I mean, what could we do specifically about something about Evo? I mean, you know, he's not, but as you say, the U.S. is totally embroiled in all these regime changes. I mean, Honduras is one of the most horrible ones because that's one of the reasons that we have such a terrible immigration problem, is that Hillary Clinton okayed the coup in Honduras and made a mess of Central America in the process. One reason I didn't particularly want to vote for her, but anyway. But better her than what we've got, but God knows. But I wish I could be more optimistic about it, but are artists here working? You said something about what are people doing here. Is there a lot of art happening here in this room or whatever about the Amazon? Not to mention Evo Morales, I mean, no? If anybody is working about this stuff, I would love to know about it, and Miguel can, or somebody can give you my email or whatever.
Actually, this is your question is related to something that I also wanted to ask Lucy, and it's exactly about this this moment in relation to the 80s, for example. You mentioned it in your talk that you were organized with some other cultural workers and activists. Organized around with cultural workers and artists and activists in the 80s in response to the U.S. military interventions in Central America, right? And that was a quite important response, right? So I wanted to ask you about that, about the 80s and now in terms of politicization of our practices.
Yeah, Central America was interesting because, again, American artists were not really concerned with Central America, to put it mildly. But Daniel Flores y Asensio, who was a Salvadoran refugee, in a sense, came up and started something called the Arts and Letters, the Institute for Arts and Letters of El Salvador in Exile. And he got hold of me and a couple of other artists, and we started this thing called Artist Call Against U.S. Intervention in Central America. And it ended up by being, we had 30 shows in New York City, and there were cities all over the United States that jumped on the bandwagon and so on. So in a funny way, people were better informed about artists in Central America or what's going down in Central America than they were about anywhere else. I mean, closer by, probably. I mean, Mexico, of course, we should be much more informed and concerned about what goes down in Mexico. But the Artist Call was, again, a revelation to me, too. We brought Salvadoran, Nicaraguan artists and writers up, and they talked, and we had performances and films and poetry readings and art shows, and even at Leo Castelli's gallery, which was the most prestigious one in New York at the time. So that was exciting.
Is there any other question or comment? Yes, here.
Oi, Lucy, é a Adele.
In Portuguese. Lucy, you need to take that.
Here.
Here.
Eu não sei se a minha pergunta...
Ok. Perdão. Eu pensei que você ia perguntar.
What are you doing?
Are you...
Em português?
Sim, em português.
Yes.
You need to... Okay. Yes. Otherwise...
Oi, Lucy. Então, eu não sei se é uma pergunta boba também, mas porque a sua apresentação, você está falando da arte de uma maneira assim tão concreta, né, na nossa vida, assim, é uma arte e eu estou com uma questão filosófica que é uma questão relacionada com o esvaziamento de identidade que a gente tem vivido desde o começo do século XX, e eu queria te perguntar a tua opinião sobre a importância da arte contemporânea justamente para isso, assim, para a nossa noção de identidade, de sujeito, se você acha que isso é uma coisa importante para a gente falar sobre. Deu para entender?
Well, that's a large question, Adele. Thanks a lot. Yeah, identity seems to sort of come and go in art terms. I spent a lot of the 1980s thinking about, in a very sort of cliched way, about identity of the other, and it would have been very smart of me. This idea came toward the end of this book called Mixed Blessings, and I'd already finished the book and I didn't do it, and I wish the hell I had, was to have the last chapter about whiteness, because as my friend Peggy works on whiteness and so on, and we were thinking about it then. The book was published in 1990, I think, but nobody really could come to grips with it, and it was so clear. In Heresies, the feminist collective on art and politics, and we published a journal, we started it with all white women, and then we suddenly thought, oh, we shouldn't have done that, but we had done that, and then we asked other people in, and that was questionable, the fact that we hadn't included people from the beginning and so on. So almost every group that I've been involved with has had to confront identity, usually from a position of guilt. But during the whole notion of multiculturalism, I don't know what went on in Brazil. You're such a multicultural society already. But in the US, it was a big thing in the 80s, multiculturalism. We suddenly realized the politics of identity, and a whole lot of people were coming, indigenous people in particular, were just beginning to sort of be included in anything and work with their identity and so forth. So it became very important, but then the politics of identity in the 90s began to be dissed by people, and it was old-fashioned or not politically correct or something to deal with identity, and it went back underground, and now I think it's back overground again. And the issue of whiteness is something that we still haven't totally confronted. And the U.S., of course, is becoming increasingly diverse, as we say now. And in another, 30 years, 50 years or something, we're going to have more people of color than white people in the U.S., like the rest of the world. I mean, there's no reason why we should be so special. But it's already an interesting process given the white supremacy of our president now, and yours. There's going to have to be a new way of looking at this kind of thing. And now if you look back at the 1980s multiculturalism, it was not superficial, it was deeply important, but there's a lot more to go. And we should be on that, it seems like.
Yes, here. And there, I think.
Peggy has one.
Okay, yes. Yeah, first, and then...
Oh, thank you. I realize that you haven't curated a show in 10 or 15 years, but if you were to curate now, what do you think would be the most important subject that you could give a voice to by curating?
Well, I mean, climate chaos or disruption, it almost has to be at the front of it, but we have to realize that all the other issues that I mentioned are tied up in climate disruption, chaos, or whatever. And the whole refugee and immigration problem is all related to, I mean, they're Central American farmers can't farm anymore, and so they're coming up and they're not being allowed in the U.S., and it's a horrible situation. So I think if you take a broader view about climate chaos and don't think of it as environmentalism per se, but environmental justice, then that's probably the issue. I don't know quite who I'd put. I'll have to think about that.
I think there is another question over there. There was a question? No. I thought it was, no. Oh, here. Oh, here.
Lucy, obrigada pela sua fala. Eu queria, I'm sorry. Eu queria só que você falasse um pouco mais. Você citou o Me Too. Como é que você vê o feminismo nos Estados Unidos hoje, a partir disso que, enfim, nós não tivemos o Me Too, mas nós tivemos aqui o Ele Não, que eu acho que foi uma questão muito, uma passeata, né, muito significativa, e acabou sendo um movimento no Brasil. Mas a gente poderia fazer esse paralelo entre os dois, mas a minha pergunta é: como é que você observa a cena nos Estados Unidos hoje, o feminismo após o Me Too?
Oh, Lord, complicated question. Complicated again. I came here to talk about activist art. Every now and then somebody says, so what should we do about climate change? Who knows? I think the Me Too movement is a wonderful thing. I think it sometimes goes too far. And I wish I didn't think that, but I've seen it just go over the edge a little bit. I mean, it's men have always been able to do anything they want to us. I don't want women to be able to do anything we want to men. I mean, so there's that problem. And there are a lot of younger feminists who are doing a lot about that. I really haven't kept up with it enough. I mean, I read about it, but I don't have any answers. And of course, the ridiculous thing is our president is an abuser and a sexist pig and so forth. And nobody, the Me Too movement doesn't seem to have gotten there. I mean, you wonder, here is the most egregious behavior in the country, the most obvious, and nobody has been able to get him down on that issue, which is appalling. And that has to do with the fact that the world is run by men, mostly. So. And some of them appear to be on his side. So. I don't have an answer. I wish I did. And your movement is called what? Not Him. Yeah, and meaning Bolsonaro. Yeah, okay. Yes, we should have a Not Him movement too.
Eu vou perguntar em português. Boa tarde. Eu queria insistir um pouco em algo que o Miguel passou. Eu queria te pedir para falar um pouco a respeito do que você poderia entender como os limites de uma arte política. O Miguel passou por essa questão um pouco quando perguntou a respeito dos sacrifícios estéticos. Você acha que existe limite? Ou, enfim, será que eu queria te pedir para desenvolver um pouco mais esse tópico, porque eu acho que ele é importante.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I have not thought it out. But I don't believe that there should be any boundaries to art. That's where I said if somebody doesn't recognize that it's art, is it still art? If you walk by an amazing image and you think, oh, it's just graffiti, or your city, we've only been here for less than 24 hours or whatever, but it's amazing, all the graffiti and the murals and the visual decoration of everything. And I was thinking, talking to Marianne Strecker from, oh, there she is, okay. And we were talking about like what can be done, and I was saying that I had a feeling that guerrilla art or anonymous art and so on was really probably the best hope. And then looking at São Paulo, it's already so decorated that I'm not sure how much guerrilla art would even be noticed, which isn't the case in most American cities. The guerrilla girls used to wheat paste things that really asked wonderful questions. I think asking questions is always sort of an interesting way of doing things. Put up questions about the issues that you care about and so on. And if it doesn't look like art, that's fine with me. I mean, I don't like the idea of a boundary between art and life, and I think if art were more in life, it would be more powerful and have more impact on life.
Is there more questions? Here.
Fazer uma pergunta. Eu queria perguntar em que medida as relações que você descreve... Não? Em que medida... Queria perguntar em que medida as relações que você descreve entre o local e o global se transformaram à medida em que a tecnologia foi avançando, mudando e o mundo foi ficando mais conectado, e em que medida essa aproximação influenciou a sua decisão de se estabelecer numa cidade pequena, num estado, enfim, fora do que seria o grande circuito urbano das artes. Sure. Então, eu queria perguntar como essa relação entre o local e o global que você descreve vem se transformando com a tecnologia e como essa transformação influenciou a sua decisão de se estabelecer no New Mexico, nesse lugar fora do grande circuito das cidades e da arte.
Well, in a sense, I wanted to move to New Mexico for a long time, but I knew I couldn't make a living doing what I did as a freelance writer. And then technology came along, and now it's much easier to write and send it off and keep in touch with things that are going on in the art world. I sometimes write about, people ask me to write catalog prefaces where I've never seen the art in the flesh, but I've seen it on the internet. But I should also say I'm a Luddite. I live off the grid. I don't have television, and I wasn't ever going to get email. And while I was doing this climate change show, a friend of mine, Isabella Gonzalez, who lived in the house that Peggy now lives in, I paid her to be my email person for the show, and it made me realize that, oh my God, you can't make a living anymore without email. I mean, I was really retrograde in that. And when I got finished, I said to Isabella, oh, I'll pay you and you can do my email for the rest of my life. And she said, hell no. And she said, no, now you bite the bullet. And she made up my address and my contact and sent me off by myself into email. And I have such mixed feelings about all the technology. On one level, it's so easy to get information. And I mean, if I hear Miguel's name, I look him up. You Google him. You didn't used to be able to do that. But life did seem both easier and a lot more fun before the internet. But I still have rarely seen any art on the internet that is really, and I think it's probably because I just don't do enough internet. I don't do surfing and stuff. But I would love to see art that was made for the internet and had an impact. Maybe it's too difficult to make an impact over the internet because it's so full of stuff. Maybe we still do need to go to the place and see the art rather than get it through all these things, these vibes. But maybe not, And I don't write for the internet. I have friends who just can write something and publish it the next day. That's completely foreign to me. But I'm an octogenarian. I'm allowed to just like lay off of all that stuff. But it's really fascinating as to what's going to come down with that. But I don't see it happening yet. And is that me, or is it happening? It's me. Okay. I mean, I sort of feel like I've seen enough art to last a few lifetimes already. So, and people are always saying, "Don't you like real art?" This sacrifice of aesthetics thing. Of course, I like real. I mean, I like to go to museums. I like to see people doing interesting things, or even just beautiful things. But it's not what concerns me for my own writing. I mean, I don't think I could write a formalist analysis of anybody's work anymore.
And related to that, I also wanted to ask you about this idea of escaping, that is actually quite present in your work since the late 60s, right? This text that you brought entitled Escape Attempts, and at the end you escape the mainstream art world, and you're actually living now in New Mexico, right? And it's a really fascinating move in a moment when everybody is seduced by being part of this kind of global, right? Art
by
world.
what?
Seduced. I mean, everybody is seduced by being part of, even like the demand of being part of the globalized art world, and you're basically escaping out of that, right?
Yeah, it's maybe just contrary of me to be in a little tiny village when, but I don't know quite where to go there. I mean, somebody else was asking about I wrote this book called The Lure of the Local, and then I thought, well, I better practice what I preach. And at that point, I moved to New Mexico because my parents had died and I could leave. And my son was set up, and I could go away and nobody would care. So, and Harmony Hammond, who I should have identified the people in that 80th birthday picture. There was Harmony Hammond, Elizabeth Hess, Sabra Moore, and Susana Torre, who were in that photograph with me gesturing or whatever. But and Harmony already lived in this village, and Judy Chicago, who was a very old friend from before feminist days, had also lived in that area, and so it just seemed like a good place to go. And it wasn't really a political decision on any level. I don't make decisions very much in my life. Somebody asked me what my methodology was, and I don't have a methodology, but I said, well, one thing leads to another, and that's the way I've lived my life and my work. And something comes along, I get interested in it, and I wander off into it. And the village, I wandered off into the village, and I've never had a moment of regret. I love living in this place, and it's not. It gets called an art village, which always annoys me because there are plenty of regular people living there, and every now and then somebody moves into town and they want to get rid of the trailers and the manufactured homes, and I wouldn't want to live there if there wasn't a mixed income village. I mean, and there are artists there. There are rich artists, there are poor artists, there are middle-class artists or whatever, and there are plenty of other people. So it's like a microcosm of the country in a curious way, although New Mexico isn't really like the rest of the country. It really was Mexico. I mean, there's a magazine that has a feature every now and then that's just, one of our states is missing, because if you say your address is New Mexico and you want to have something sent, people will say, oh, we can't do international. I mean, and they think that Arizona is next to Texas and New Mexico isn't there at all for some reason. I mean, so we're in a curious way a forgotten state, and we didn't get statehood until the Americans came in and conquered it from the Mexicans in 1846. And statehood didn't come till 1912, and the reason for that was that people said it was full of snakes and Indians and Mexicans, and this was not, the United States didn't want New Mexico in it. It took that long to get there. So in a funny way, people have called New Mexico the third world of the United States, and in a curious way that a little bit of that is still around, although it's been gentrified and anglicized and so forth. It doesn't really.
Oh, yes.
Hi, Lucy. You said that we need to downsize or die.
She's speaking English.
Okay. In English. Hi, Lucy. You said that we need to downsize or die. How do you see the standards? Downsize or die. How do you see the standards for large-scale exhibitions? And do you think it's possible to have an art that is global and at the same time still produce local difference?
Is that a question there?
Yeah. What do you feel about large-scale exhibitions?
Yes.
And of a practice that is global, but still produces...
Like biennales and things? It was...
Sorry?
Well, I was telling somebody last night that I've been to 2 biennales in my life, and one of them was in 1959, and one of them was in 2007, and I've never been to an art fair, so I'm not. That's not my part of art. I mean, I don't know much about that stuff, and I dislike exhibitions that are much too large to see. But that's what? Oh, okay. What was the question?
Okay, so you are not used to large-scale exhibitions, right? So, but still, do you think it's possible to have an art that is global and at the same time produce local difference?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do, because, I mean, not all local places are alike, but they're not all that different either. I mean, I think once you understand, I'm trying to think of somebody who works that way, who really works on local things, and my mind has gone completely blank at this point. So, but I do think it's possible, and a very good idea. I mean, I think if you write about a little town in New Mexico, a little town maybe in Brazil will understand what you're talking about. Maybe not. Brazil may be a little far away, but. Other people in little towns or I think in Europe to some extent. But the culture is so important, I mean, and the cultures are so different, and I think people need to understand that too, that everybody is not like Americans, which we tend to think that everybody should be like Americans, and that we can, as you said before, do regime change with no conscience whatsoever. And then we're now trying to impeach the president for working with a foreign country, not like we haven't done it forever. I mean, this is what we do, is work with a foreign country. But anything we can do to get him out of the way is fine. I know this doesn't really answer your question, but I can't think of an example of somebody totally doing that. Well. Oh yeah, I'm involved in that. Yeah.
And what do you think about his idea of this global exhibition that it is still produced locally? Do you think it achieves its goals? Yes.
I'm just having trouble with hearing it.
I'm sorry.
You mean global exhibition like the Do It project, which is every country and thousands of people?
Do you think this exhibition it achieved its goals?
I don't know exactly what its goals were. I know Hans Ulrich Obrist is the sort of person behind it, and it's really a conceptual art idea that you ask people, what would you do? I mean, you're supposed to, I can't even remember frankly what I said. I think I said make art that will change the world. Do it. But a lot of them are more subtle than that.
And how do you were involved in it?
How do we what?
How do you were involved in it?
In global? In that project, well, as I said, I just did one of these little do it things and asked people to change the world with their art.
Okay. Thank you.
Speaking of optimism. I'm running down.
Okay. Is there one last question, maybe? I actually one phrase. You were quoting yourself because this is something that you already wrote in a text, I think from the 90s maybe. It says, social energies not recognized as art.
Yeah, social energies not yet recognized as art. That was something I wrote in around 1970 or something, and I've always loved it. Nobody ever quotes me saying this, so I guess nobody else loves it. But that's really what interests me. Is what I mean. If you see something on the street, is this art? Was this made by an artist or not? And if not, then here's another social energy that should be recognized as art. I mean, a lot of people just don't want to call themselves artists, and then there are people who call themselves artists who shouldn't, and so forth.
And actually, I feel that one of your main contributions during the 70s and 80s through this feminist lens is exactly questioning the structure of valorization of art, and this phrase is totally related to that. And I remember this really brilliant essay that you brought in the late 70s when you were questioning how women's art usually has been labeled as hobby. Remember that? It's as hobby. You know, hobby? How do you say in English? Hobby.
Oh,
hobby, right? Yeah. And also another text that you wrote around that time about propaganda, for example. Why propaganda is not art, right? Or in your books for like the mixed blessings one, when you were including indigenous artists, Native American artists, people of color, you know, and creating this very complex understanding of what is America, what America could be, what is American art, right?
And America, as Alfredo Jar, the Chilean artist, has said, you know, I should have had that slide, but he did a piece in Times Square many years ago that showed the two continents, North and South America, and across it is written America. And I was reading something the other day about some artist who says she's from the Americas. She doesn't say that she's from the US or from Brazil or whatever. She says she's from Las Americas. And I think that would be lovely if we could get to that place. I mean, where we're more collaboration or identity, national identity was not important. Identity, I think cultural identity should be important. It should stay important because cultures are important and we should know much more about everybody's culture. But national identity should be gotten rid of as soon as possible.
And I also like that, and I'm going to finish with this because I know you are tired, and how this recent emergence of feminist demands, but also indigenous demands, you know, black bodies demands are questioning the boundaries of what we understood as art, and also the idea of nation state. You know how I was talking with Mario this morning about how, for example, doing a research about Amazonian artists, indigenous artists from the Amazonian region, make us clear that it is no way to keep talking about nation state, right? Because it's totally useless, right? And we need to actually invent or trying to imagine different demarcations, so I think that's quite important.
Well, like the bioregional breakup of the United States that was talked about 20 years ago or so, quite a bit, where instead of these sort of totally artificial state boundaries, that we should be using the watersheds as the way of defining regions, because then we'd all have something more in common. I mean, you know, but that hasn't happened either. So. Marianne and I went through yesterday all the demands that the Art Workers Coalition made in 1969, and it was fascinating because we didn't achieve any of them. I mean, it's really sad, but we were demanding this and demanding that, and there were 13 demands, and none of them have happened, I think. Maybe one sort of did, yeah.
Well, with that, I wanted to thank you so much, Lucy, for your presence here and for your lovely talk, and thank you all. We have another talk in 10 minutes? 30 minutes. We have another talk in 30 minutes. Thank you so much.
We better get off.